practices come together in primary care, they almost always talk about a merger. The reason for this is because that's actually the only way to acquire a GP practice is through a merger process of the partnerships. In reality though, many of these so-called mergers are actually acquisitions. While the legal mechanism for merging or acquiring practices is actually the same by going through a partnership merger route, the reality and the facts on the ground are often very different. In an acquisition, the acquiring practice will typically impose their systems, their process, their staffing and their models onto the practice being acquired. As such, this imposes a great deal of change on the practice. Whereas in a true merger, what will happen is that the two practices will look at each other and think about what can they learn from each other, what practices can they share, and how can they both change to become a more effective and efficient practice. When two practices come together, whether in reality it's a merger or an acquisition, what actually happens from a legal perspective is there is a transfer of assets and liabilities from one entity into another. So what's important legally is to document what's going and what's staying. Which assets are coming into the merged entity from indeed both potentially of the legacy practices, and which ones are staying behind, and which liabilities are coming across and which ones are staying behind. It's very important to get this documented into what we would typically call a business merger agreement or a business transfer agreement, because without documenting it, there's no real way of knowing what's transferred across. And indeed, if there are liabilities, who's responsible for paying those liabilities? Some of the bigger risks to be aware of would be associated with the property, so perhaps lease liabilities, dilapidations on the buildings, perhaps redemption penalties associated with the mortgage. Other concerns would be, for example, pension liabilities. We've seen liabilities there running into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, or perhaps disputes with suppliers or employees. So what we would recommend is when you're considering a merger or an acquisition, the first step you take is to document what you want to happen in a heads of terms. That's essentially saying what is the deal, what's the transaction that you're contemplating. Secondly, you should do your due diligence. Due diligence should be both financial due diligence and legal due diligence on the contractual and obligations and liabilities that might be in the business. And then thirdly, document what you're transferring in and what you're leaving behind. You document that in a business merger agreement. The reason you want this well documented is in case something goes wrong, in case something emerges further down the road, you want to be able to say what was the intent of the parties as to who was to pick up that liability or indeed who owns that asset. You can only do that if you've got a document that you can rely on, so you'll want to ensure that it's well drafted by somebody who understands the primary care environment.